Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Top 10 Tips for Selecting a Threat and Vulnerability Management Solution. My name is Raleigh Gould and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Our featured speakers are David Monahan, Managing Research Director at Enterprise Management Associates, and John Dasher, Vice President of Product Marketing at RiskSense. David's in-depth security experience, which spans over 20 years, has included organizing and managing physical and information security programs, including security and network operations for organizations ranging from Fortune 100 companies to local government. He has contributed content to a wide variety of industry forums and periodicals, including State Tech, CIO, CSO, and Computer World magazine. An industry veteran, John brings extensive technology marketing and product development experience to the table. He has over a decade of experience in enterprise and consumer cybersecurity, most recently at Enlightened, where he served as Vice President of Products and Marketing. And before I hand things over to today's featured speakers, I wanted the audience to know that David and John will be dedicating the last 10 minutes or so to answering your questions. Do feel free to log them anytime using the Q&A functionality. Also, today's event is being recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email from EMA that will include the on-demand replay as well as some additional resources, so I hope you will check that out. And now I'd like to hand things over to our first featured speaker, David Monahan. David?
Thanks, Raleigh, and thanks everyone for joining today for Top 10 Tips for Selecting Threat and Vulnerability Management Solution. I think we have some good information for you today, so we'll just dive right in. First, we just want to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of definitions, and so we wanted to put together a definition for threat management, right? And ultimately, it is an approach to security that's designed to thwart threats, right? So, and threats are equivalent to attacks in our environments, and ultimately, the goal is to do that before they actually become a problem, before they compromise the system. Ultimately, threat management is a prevention type strategy, right? And it can be difficult because obviously you're trying to stop things that, one, could be day zeros, you don't know what's going on, as well as just things that have happened in the past. However, trying to take a proactive approach to threat management and stopping things before they happen is ultimately less costly than dealing with the aftermath. What we've seen in many reports, I think IBM has a report they put out every year around the cost of a breach, and that one's pretty nasty. I think last year was $240-some per record breach is the cost, as well as an average cost of several $million per breach. So if we can get proactive on this and stop these types of breaches from happening and stop attacks from being successful, then we also have the capability of lowering our cost overall, which is associated with lowering risk. Additionally, when we look at threat management, many aspects today have to be done through an automated system. There's no way we can keep up with millions of devices and attacks in a manual process. We just don't have the human resources available in the world to be able to do that. So as we look at systems and threat management, one of the key aspects we're going to talk about today is automated systems and trying to meet the needs of the system administrators and security and even the users rather than trying to be reactive on that or just deal with the whole manually. Vulnerability management is the other aspect today that we want to talk about. And a vulnerability is something that's a flaw in a system, right? It's a flaw in the software, it's a flaw in architecture. Somewhere in that system is a problem that can be exploited, right? And that's what makes risk. So at times vulnerability is risk. So ultimately we're trying to be proactive on this as well and identify the vulnerabilities that are out there in these architectures, softwares, controls, etc., and ultimately try to be proactive in managing those and removing those or mitigating those as quickly as possible. If we can keep anyone from being able to infiltrate the system or having the ability to infiltrate the system, then we're also successful as well. Ultimately, we do think this is challenging, and in talking to practitioners, and having been a practitioner myself, I know that this is a significantly daunting task. There are thousands and thousands of vulnerabilities, and there's new ones released every day in various systems. So if you're in an enterprise environment, the probability is that every week at least you're going to have some sort of vulnerability you have to deal with, and it's not just one vulnerability. As we know, when we have to deal with it from a system perspective, it's one vulnerability times however many systems we have, so we're back to having to deal with it from thousands of issues perspective. But again, if you can do it proactively, you have less cost than you have from the post-breach perspective. So we absolutely do want to try and do this as much as possible. We also had the same issue with threats, is that having to scale out and identify these manually and deal with them manually is virtually impossible because of the scale that we're dealing with. I did some research last year that showed a couple of curves that were very interesting in terms of the number of manpower that we have, or the manpower that we have in an organization stays the same over time, let's say relatively speaking, but in that particular environment, right, the number of vulnerabilities that we have stacking up if we're not able to do it automatically and deal with them increases significantly over the course of a year. And then if you look at that again times the number of systems and average growth, it becomes pretty significant. But ultimately, we want to make sure that we leverage the tools that we can in those automated systems and the controls that we have to be able to overcome the issues around manual processes. So let's dig in. John.
Yeah, so let's set up the problem a bit. Dave mentioned, there's thousands of vulnerabilities out there, and to put a number on it, I actually looked this morning. It's not even 102,000 vulnerabilities. It's 106,000 vulnerabilities. So we're always finding, the problem keeps getting bigger. And as you pointed out, what we really want to look at is the number of assets your organization has. And then we know that on average, each asset has 7 critical vulnerabilities. So it's some easy multiplication to say, 7 times the number of assets starts to give you a bit of scope around your problem. The challenge, of course, we have is that the average time most organizations take to remediate a critical vulnerability is more than 60 days. And 2 things typically happen within that time frame. 1, more vulnerabilities are discovered. And 2, the software that we're running on our assets gets updated. And so it's this constant, challenge of trying to remediate the vulnerabilities that are relevant to the assets that are in actual use. Now, there's lots of tools out there. There's no doubt about it. But the challenge most of us have with our current tool set is that we lack visibility about what's going on cross-organizationally. We lack visibility about what's going on between, say, the security organization and the IT organization. And it makes things hard to collaborate. We also have a hard time quantifying and measuring our risk. We need some way of not only baselining where we are today, but where we are tomorrow, and whether or not our activities, whether or not the activities our security and IT organizations undertake are in fact making a difference. That's the key thing. And what we need to accomplish that is real prioritization. That word gets thrown around a lot, but what we want is not simply a sorted spreadsheet of 106,000 vulnerabilities, but rather we want to know which vulnerabilities are relevant to the assets in our specific organization at this point in time and prioritize those. David?
So ultimately, when we look at the situation, right, we want to try and address both threats and vulnerabilities, and we understand that we have to look at these as a business problem. So let's go through the top 10 tips. First one, the systems that help us to manage threat and vulnerabilities have to allow us access to the underlying information. Specifically, we look at different teams have different requirements, and they're going to need information about these systems and threats and the vulnerabilities to do their job. So we have DevOps, and they're looking for problems with software that they've created, right, so that they can go back and patch those. We've got IT Ops, which has to worry about deployment and administration and updating of systems. And then, for example, you have SecOps, which ultimately has to devise the plan for identifying remediation and mitigating the threats and vulnerabilities. And SecOps and IT Ops work very, very closely together, or at least they should, in order to deal with these most effectively. I know in some organizations there are artificial boundaries that are placed between those teams, and that makes it difficult. Additionally, without allowing access to underlying information, we want to be able to use some sort of context-sensitive capabilities to get to the information. A lot of times that's like, for example, a right-click on an item. So we identify, oh, here's a vulnerability or here's a threat. Let's right-click on it and go down and see what the details are around that particular overlying summary. Additionally, when we work on it, some of our business requirements look at the interface for data query. Right? If you're going to try and find information about the relevance of a threat or vulnerability, you need to be able to query information about that within the system to find the details, or to find out, for example, if you're looking at a particular threat, have you seen that threat, or is that threat an issue across multiple assets, or is it just a single asset or category of assets? And a lot of times when you're doing this type of work, you need to be able to query information. So it's important that we're able to get to that information via some sort of query aspect. And then lastly, a drill down around the dashboard. So if you have a static dashboard that shows you a number, that can be useful from a high-level perspective, but it doesn't get us to where we need to be from a practitioner perspective. Right? For executives, they don't need to drill down. And in fact, many times, in all honesty, we don't want them to drill down because they have other things that they need to worry about, and we should be worrying about as the practitioners being able to do the work there. So we want to be able to get down to the lower level information to understand what's driving that dashboard and or what's driving our need to be able to address that. So if we come up with below whatever our status line is, or our goal line, we want to be able to see what's affecting that so we can then go back to where John was talking about prioritizing what's going on. Number 2, we want to assist in operational flexibility. As I mentioned just a moment ago, there are different teams that have different requirements and responsibilities. So ultimately, as we look at operational flexibility, we need to identify means of asset discovery, vulnerability discovery, the threat discovery. Right? What does the system do? How does it help us in the investigation process? Which teams? Right? The lifecycle management and changes are very important as well. As we mentioned, each team on the right here, the DevOps, IT, and SecOps, each have a different responsibility in the way that they're going to deal with the problem and help to assist overall. So how are we helping those teams to integrate and operate together? Lastly, problem remediation. How does it help us to actually solve the problem? We have plenty of systems out there that can tell us, yes, there's a problem. Chicken Little is screaming that the sky is falling, but that does not ultimately help us in moving forward and reducing risk. So the system should help us to be able to remediate problems as they're identified through whatever our life cycle is. And again, as I mentioned, it's very important that the handoffs work between the teams that are involved. Whichever teams are in your organizations, whether physical teams, logical teams, shared, whatever dotted line, however your organization is matrixed, the people that are involved in dealing with these have to be able to smoothly work together, or you're going to delay the ability to be able to resolve the issue.
I think that's a key word that you use there, David, the word handoff. So many times we see organizations where, for a variety of reasons, some historical, some systemic, but instead of a handoff, we have more of a throw it over the wall. It's now someone else's problem.
That happens a lot. Absolutely. And so really we want to make sure that we're being more effective, because that's an area where a lot of time is lost. Number 3, delivering a living knowledge database. So as John talked about earlier, right, the information that we get is constantly being updated and changing out in the world. But the question is can we get the association of that information back to us as the practitioner in our world, in our island? And we shouldn't be isolated as an island. We need to be able to have that information moving freely from wherever it's coming into the environment such that we can ultimately deal with it. So one of the things that I think is very important is the system that you're dealing with should have some sort of information around the asset history, what's been the problem with these systems in the past, so you understand where it's going. And one of the aspects that's really useful for this is not only the changing threat over time, but are we introducing the same problems again and again? So one of the things I've seen in the past is identify a problem, let's say with custom software that's built in-house. So DevOps has a program they've worked on, a solution of some kind, application, and we identify a problem. We send it back over to them. Oh yeah, we fixed that. Right? You get it back again, and for that particular time it seems to be fixed, but then it gets introduced again later in a different build. Right? Something happens, and stuff happens, or it doesn't actually get fixed. They thought it was, maybe, and then when you rescan it, it's a problem. Now on the other side, right, there can be false positives. We want to deal with those as well. But we want to make sure that the information that we have about the threats and the vulnerabilities and the assets is able to be updated over time. So again, we can see what's going on and ultimately know: are we just rehashing the same problems? Are we not getting anywhere? Do we make small gains and then fall back again? But this will help us to make better program decisions in how we're going to improve our processes and ultimately reduce the risk in the long run. The other aspect I have here is producing the red team expertise. And if you're familiar with the red team, blue team, right? Red teams are attack teams, blue teams are defense teams. But by the red team expertise, what I'm talking about is we would like the system to be able to validate exploits and validate the information that's receiving. If you're just getting information, hey, here's a new threat out there. Well, great. Are there any active campaigns? Are there any test exploit code or things like that available? What are we seeing out there? So these types of information are very useful for us for helping to identify the overall risk of that particular threat, and also to prioritize where in the stack it should be. Because you may have two different threats that are out there, one of which does not have weaponized code, one of which does. Well, even if the second one maybe has a lower risk rating overall, or threat probability overall, if there's actually a weaponized program out there, you may want to prioritize it first because more than likely it's going to be a bigger threat, right? So you have to put all those into account to ultimately make the final decision. Last, support augmentative services across the network application database and IoT realms. Well, ultimately the folks that are out there and the skill sets that are out there to identify the problems, right? They're not just looking at an isolated item or an isolated threat. You have to look at it across the entirety of your environment and how does it affect you based on what you've deployed out there. Any thoughts on that, John?
Well, I think one of the big values that red team expertise provides, of course, is that temporal aspect. A lot of times when we look up vulnerabilities in databases, they're somewhat out of date. There's always a lag between when stuff gets reported to when it's in active use. And the red team expertise, one of the big values is it takes the theoretical, and turns it into the verified real at this point in time, and it can't overstate its value.
Absolutely, absolutely. So next, we need to enhance the context to improve security. I think that comes a little bit to what you're saying there with the red team expertise, in that as information comes in about a particular vulnerability, we also need to be able to apply that to our environment. And I've got the items listed out here: network, applications, database, IoT, whatever's in your environment you've deployed, creating that context around how it's applicable to each of the aspects of our environment is very important. And that's going to be different for every organization out there, at least to some degree, right? We all use networks, applications, databases, and we all probably have IoT in our environment somewhere, whether we've managed it or not. But the way it's deployed and the way it's constructed and the compensating controls and so forth that we have in place are different, right? And our networks and our environments are living, breathing things because every day we're putting out new information. So ultimately we want to have context around those vulnerabilities and even the threats to help us to understand. Additionally, we want to enrich the vulnerability information and the threat information so that we have a business context, again, that helps with our prioritization. We want to ultimately, it also helps with optimizing our response, improving the threat remediation, and accelerating risk reduction, right? Because ultimately, as we move down these particular items, the goal is to reduce risk. And then we know we're not going to be able to reduce risk to zero for any particular item and still conduct business. The goal is still to get it down as close to zero as possible. And if we can reduce the threat, or we can reduce the probability of a threat, or we can reduce the vulnerabilities by either direct remediation or through mitigating control, then we're again reducing that risk overall. So getting to the context and understanding that within the environment is definitely a key aspect. Any thoughts, John?
Yeah, I mean, and the other part of that context, of course, is dealing with things that are known to be active. Again, there's the theoretical, there's what's been discovered in the wild, but I also want to know what's actively being exploited. Absolutely, absolutely.
So number 5. Facilitating integration automations. This comes back to, in my opinion, one of the key aspects of the whole thing. And by the way, these are all just in alphabetical order based on the first word. There's not a prioritization in here from a numerical perspective, but I think this one is absolutely key. We keep hearing within our environments about the lack of skill set or the lack of people, and so the only way to deal with that is to look at automations. So whatever solution you're going to choose has to be able to automate as much of the process as possible and then pull it back to the individuals that are responsible in a meaningful way. So automation is going to help us there. It's going to help us to prioritize these items. It's going to ultimately help us to get better outcomes and remediate them faster and better. Okay, the integrations are also important because we all have multiple tools that we use to facilitate our operations and security programs, and so getting the information into one repository is good, but we have to be able to make it useful through these integrations and getting it out to the very end. You've got a ton of tools listed here, and you probably have others in your mind that you have in your organization, but we want to have the integration between the vulnerability scanners and the common vulnerabilities and exploits. We need to have information about IP reputation, right? That's what's going on out there. But then when we get inside, what about our asset management systems? What about our ticketing systems, our SIMs, our firewalls? All these other tools out there that are helping us to identify problems in our environment or security issues, as well as being able to help us throughout the life cycle. Very, very important. Any thoughts, John?
I think the one thought I'd offer regarding automation is automation is a hugely valuable tool, but we also want to make sure that we're not simply automating a bad process. We want to make sure we're automating the right things.
Right, because we can get to a bad outcome faster, and so that is actually very important from that perspective. Exactly. You have to have a good foundation for your processes and what your workflows are. Again, otherwise you're going to get to a bad place even faster, and that doesn't really help us because we're going to have to do rework anyway. Yep, absolutely.
Exactly.
Number 6, operate as a force multiplier. This comes back directly to the issue with the people that we don't have or the lack of skill set that we have because we have the new folks, or even the fact that if we're overworking the folks that have a lot of skill, they may not be able to stay experienced as to the new and latest and greatest threats and vulnerabilities. So ultimately, whatever tool you have has to be able to work well to augment those people's capabilities. And regardless of the tool, my favorite item in this is, how can we take someone who has less skill and help them to operate and provide more value at the front end of the process such that the people that they would normally escalate to right off the bat can actually provide the higher value services for their organization in doing other things, and whether that's architecture work or working with the business people or whatever the case may be, there's other things that people with high skill sets can do other than a lower set of triage because you have someone that isn't able to or doesn't have the skill set to do their job effectively. And so how do these tools help those newer skilled individuals get better? And of course that helps the whole organization move up the chain in terms of value. So we can avoid the delays in mitigation remediation, and as we mentioned earlier, a threat of the breach and so forth, that costs real money, which we want to avoid. So investing in a proper tool helps us to save money on the backside, which ultimately helps us with our ROI on those tools. I think from that perspective, these are really key aspects. John, your thoughts?
I think the human resources part can't be overlooked. You made a great point about making sure that your less experienced folks can really have their value maximized. But I think the other thing that people don't necessarily consciously think about is as you're investing in tools, to the extent the tools help less experienced people become more experienced, that increases their job satisfaction. That lowers turnover. And that lessens a problem that many of us have, not just finding talent, but keeping the talent we have.
Absolutely, and as a kind of a note to that, in my past, I worked for managed security services quite a number of years ago for a very long time, and this was during the .com boom. And one of the ways that we were able to keep people there during this time of churn from an outside perspective was providing that sort of training and useful experience and providing the Tier 3 people the opportunity to train those people and bring them up. Right? It wasn't about holding on to their information so that they could be the man, right, or whatever you want to say, but being able to share that information. So I think that's very important.
Yep.
Number 7, producing appropriate metric reporting. So anyone here who's at the operational level knows that the folks above them want reports, and the folks that are at the management level know they need the reports in order to do their jobs and direct the programs and address their higher level management as well. So ultimately, whatever tool you select needs to be able to address not only standard reports, because there's a lot of things that are in common, but especially the ad hoc reporting capabilities, because I haven't walked into an environment yet where I haven't thought of a new report that a tool didn't offer out of the box, and I had to create that report. So I'm having a hard time this morning. Facilitating that is very, very important. If you can't do that, then ultimately I think business is going to be restricted. And so as you think of your requirements and you're doing your proof of concept testing, make sure that you have a sufficient ability to create reports that ad hoc that you may need. And during the POC, you're probably not going to think of everything you need, but if you identify the fact the tool has the capabilities, then I think you're on the right track. Also, with the existing reports or the reports you create, remember that each of them has to deal with different levels of need. So, for example, your executives, right? They're going to want reports that help them to make strategic decisions across the entire practice and ultimately reduce risk. Middle management has to get a little bit of technical and a little bit of strategic, so they can be, if you will, the translators between the folks at the front lines and the executives, and they're going to make a combination of strategic and tactical decisions based on what's coming out of that. And so they're going to help to reduce that or identify the effect on organizational risk, the man hours needed to address any individual problems or program issues and so forth. And then lastly, as technical folks, we need to be able to get down to the nitty-gritty of what's going on within those reports so we can identify what are the action items we have to take in order to make the needle move. John, your thoughts?
You mentioned metrics as well as reporting, and the reporting can't overstate its importance in terms of having flexible reporting. Having said that, let's make sure we're measuring and reporting on the right thing. An analogy I like to use is if you look at marketing, if you look at leads, we can go to a trade show and we can scan people's badges and we can get a ton of leads. But they're not necessarily valuable leads for us because they were coming to our booth just to get a shirt. In the same way, we don't simply want to look at those 106,000 vulnerabilities. We want to measure the vulnerabilities that are relevant to us at this point in time. And so it's really key that the metrics you choose are the right ones.
I think that's very, very important, absolutely. All right, number 8, providing platform scalability and performance. So for any of you who have worked in a large environment, you know that scalability and performance are absolutely key for doing your jobs. Whatever the system is, whether it's a ticketing system, whether it's a vulnerability management system, whatever. So from that perspective, we have to not only look at it from the security perspective, but also from the IT ops and the DevOps. Again, all these teams are going to be involved in this process during its life cycle. So when we look at what these teams need, we need to understand how are they going to interface with the system. We need to understand how often and how much, and that's going to be a part of the scalability and performance. And then how much information has to come into the system and flow out of the system and be processed on an hourly, a daily, a weekly, a monthly basis. And so estimations have to be made there to understand these types of things. When we have a peak issue, whether it's a new ransomware campaign or whatever the case may be, there's going to be more inputs and outputs to that system. Is it able to keep up with that and those requirements? That could be querying the system, for information. That could be addressing and identifying all of the assets that are susceptible to that particular threat. Whatever the case is, but you're going to have different times are going to facilitate or necessitate different types of interaction with the system, and it has to be able to do that. And of course, the business grows over time. If you're in a startup or a medium-sized business and things are going well, you're going to continue to grow. If you're in an enterprise, hopefully things are going to continue to grow as well. So no matter where you are in that life cycle of the size of your business, you have to look at the tool from an expectation that you're going to have it for a number of years. It shouldn't just be a 1 to 3 year investment. It's hopefully going to be a 5 to 10 to 15 year investment, and the tool will be able to scale and grow with you. Of course, that is also reliant upon the vendor to maintain that tool over time, and so looking at the vendor and their aspects are going to be important as well. John?
The timeliness of the reporting and the performance is important. A lot of users of SIMs have told me that they have to run reports overnight because it drags the system to its knees, and you really want to make sure that as you look at a solution that it doesn't suffer from that sort of performance hit when you actually need to get data out of it.
Yep, and not only from a quantity of data perspective, but how is it architected to deliver that data? I mean, it may be that it's not an issue of the SIM volume of data. Maybe the SIM is designed to only produce these in batches at a given time. So from that perspective,
Fair enough.
you need to understand, is that something I can control? As an administrator of that system, can I come back and say, oh, I want this data batch to be able to run every 15 minutes or every hour or a day or whatever the case may be? And if I do that, how is that going to impact the overall system? If it's number crunching during that particular time and a big event comes in, is that going to impact operational performance? So these are things that you have to take into account and really query the vendors on, both for making sure you have that flexibility to do what you need to do, but also if you make certain business choices that may work on an average day, are they going to work at a peak day as well? Very important.
Yeah, not only
Thanks.
talk to the vendors, but talk to their customers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the reputable vendors have customers that you can talk to, right? If they're not just vaporware, shelfware, or whatever, right? They'll have somebody that you can talk to find out, hey, what are you doing with the system? How is it working for you? And granted, we know that they're going to give you the positive customers, and that's okay, right? Because if you ask the right questions and think about it, then I really don't think that the customers themselves are going to lie to you. From that perspective, I've never had anybody that I've been able to identify was trying to mislead me on behalf of the vendor, right? And so I think that's not an issue, but I don't take that as a bias, quote unquote, problem. I think it's called informed because they can look at that vendor and go, well, we've got our head beneath the covers there and beneath the hood, and we can see what's going on and give you some input. And I think that vendors are not vendors. The customers are pretty forthright in identifying, well, here's some things that don't work well for us. So I think that's a very good aspect as well. All right, number 9, support data compartmentalization. So this is good from a number of aspects. One, we know that the data coming in could be sensitive, and it could be that we want to be able to compartmentalize it from a need to know. We don't want everybody to be able to get to all the information on the system because of the nature of the system or what it does, as well as the type of issue. So as we look at data compartmentalization, we want to look at it from not only from our needs, right? Do we need multi-tenant, multi-agency, departments, clients, whatever the case is, multi-team, right? So as we think about this, can we compartmentalize data so that people, one, aren't overwhelmed? We don't want to give them. We don't want to just compartmentalize data because it may be sensitive. It may be that it's able to help us keep them focused on their part of the problem, and so we can focus the dashboards, the views, the information, the metrics, whatever the case is, and the underlying data even, so that they can manage their part of the business better. It could also be that we're looking at it from a multi-department or agency perspective. We get into very large groups. I might have responsibility for buildings A, B, and C on the campus, and somebody else might have responsibility for buildings A, B, and C on a different campus. And we don't want to get those two mixed up from an operational flow perspective, so then we have people looking at the wrong thing and not dealing with their particular issue. So role-based access controls, RBAC, can be very important, as well as data isolation, being able to create the appropriate cross-organizational views so that not only can we see what's important to us, but we also do have the opportunity to get that big picture where it's appropriate and in being able to drill down. So each of these views is important, and we think about that. It may be that we have one team that serves all, not a problem, and this is not an issue for you, but you want to think about it from a growth perspective, again, because if you're going to have the system for 5, 10 plus years, the structure you have today may not be the structure that you have then. What are your thoughts, John?
Well, and of course, the other piece in there that's highly related is any regulatory and compliance requirements that your specific organization or industry might have.
Absolutely, and different organizations have a different level of need for compliance, and we want to make sure that you're looking at the ability to facilitate that particular structure, because if you start mixing data and your compliance auditor comes in and says, oh, this is a problem, now what do you do, right? Absolutely. Number 10, simplifying collaboration. So if I haven't kind of alluded to this enough in the past with the multiple team aspect, we do need to make sure that whoever is going to be able or need to work on these is able to do it well, and it's not just a throw it over the wall, as John mentioned earlier. It's an actual handoff process. So one of the things that I've seen in the past are these silo issues, and organizations have them. Big organizations tend to suffer from them more, but the smaller organizations can have them too. And there's 3 primary silos that I see come into play: data, tools, and political. Now, political are the people. They make choices, right? This is mine, 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 or whatever. If you think of the seagulls in Finding Nemo or whatever, for whatever reason, they want to control the information because they think it's power or they think it's control or whatever. And so that can be an issue in and of itself, and we can't help you with that. I'm sorry, but unfortunately that's out of our scope. But we can help you with the other two, if you think about this from a data and tools perspective. So the data silos come from either a lack of data, right? You don't have the systems configured correctly, or you don't have the ability for data to move based on your architecture, and so you can't get it into a single place to be able to improve context and so forth. Tools are also the issue. You may not have a tool in place, right? Lack of tools. You may have the tools misconfigured, and so ultimately, that's going to impact your ability to collect data. It may also be that your architecture again impacts your tool's ability to communicate, or to have, you have blind spots in your organization because the tools can't get there to collect information or distribute information. So as you think about buying a tool like this, think about the existing architecture that you have within your environment and how that information is going to need to move, and how does that facilitate or hamper the ability of not only the people to collaborate, but the tools. And that comes back to an integration aspect and things like that. But collaboration is going to be absolutely key, and if you compartmentalize everything inappropriately or to the nth degree, it's going to negatively affect your ability to collaborate appropriately. So when we facilitate collaboration across security, DevOps, IT ops, ultimately we're able to better identify the relevant threats. We can better prioritize the response. We also have the ability, which is I think key, to orchestrate remediation across whatever the systems are. Right? Because security doesn't own all the systems, and security may not even be able to make changes to the system. They may have to come back to IT ops and DevOps to have those particular controls or remediations put in place. And then ultimately when you're done, part of collaboration is having a closed loop methodology so that everybody knows that it got done, and it got done when it got done right, and it can be checked off, and it's not just, hey, I need to make an email to Bob or Sue to find out if this got taken care of. So collaboration is key ultimately to making everything work well. What do you think, John?
I think that's a great point, and the other point I would add to that is, in this brave new world of cloud and Internet of Things, we also now have, OT, operational technology.
Yep.
And so, as we think about, our tools and solutions spanning departments and silos, we don't want to forget them.
Yeah, absolutely, and we've seen over the last few years, probably 2 to 3 years especially, the combination or the combining of operational technologies with IT technologies, and trying to manage those from a centralized group, or at least transfer the information across those silos better. So absolutely an important aspect. All right, so to summarize the items that we've come across so far, I like this particular slide because we can just hit on them real quick, right? We want to allow access to underlying information. We want to assist in operational flexibility. We want to deliver a living knowledge database. We want to enhance context to improve security, facilitate integration and automation, operate as a force multiplier, produce appropriate metrics and reporting, provide platform scalability and performance, support data compartmentalization, and ultimately simplify collaboration. Just any thoughts on the summary real quick, John?
No, I think these are great points, and to the extent someone uses this list as a shopping list, if you will, to go out and evaluate solutions that are right for them, I think this will really get them in the right ballpark.
Thank you. And to everyone out there that's listening today, I think it is important to note that this is obviously the high-level list, and we drilled down into a number of items. Definitely keep those in consideration and make up your own. Right? I can't say that we caught everything in the time that we have, but I think this is a great start for helping you identify how to choose an appropriate system for your organization. So John, I think you have some thoughts as well.
Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about RiskSense and what RiskSense brings to the party. What I'd like to do is briefly cover how we approach managing vulnerabilities and threats to prioritize your remediation efforts so that you can achieve those measurable security posture improvements. The way this works is pretty simple. We first ingest a variety of data sources via APIs, flat file import, connectors, and we do this for dozens of different network, database, and application scanners from leading vendors like Qualys, Imperva, and IBM, respectively. Then we take all that data and we aggregate the vulnerability data. We normalize it for common terminology, data scales. We're mapping it to CWE, CVE, OWASP, you name it. We're really getting that context. Here's that word again, context. Making sure that everything can be made relevant or not to my environment, and that assists in the prioritization downstream.
Let me hit on that as well. I think that the word you use there, which I think is absolutely key, is the normalize part. Having worked in operations before, and like in the old days, the worst thing was not having normalized data. So that, for example, you'd get an alert from an upstream router, and then all of a sudden you'd start getting tickets and alerts from everything below it because you couldn't see it if you're monitoring remotely, right? And so the ability to normalize the data to ultimately get to the core issues was significant. And the same thing can happen with vulnerabilities and threats, right? So I absolutely love the fact that you guys are able to take this and kind of boil it down, normalize it, and give me the same information across the stream of data that I'm looking at.
Yeah, that can be maddening to find that because you've pulled information from disparate sources, each of which are useful, but because their data scales are 1 out of 7 versus 1 out of 5 versus 1 out of 10, for example, that all of a sudden now you're having to. And again, it's not like it's the hardest problem in the world to solve, but you've got to solve it at scale, and you've got to solve it continuously.
Yep.
So anyway, after we do that, we contextualize all this data by correlating the vulnerability relationships with multiple external threat intelligence sources. These could be looking at 0 days, malware, even on the dark web. One of the things we're trying to get a feel for here is what threats are being what vulnerabilities are being actively exploited. Because if I've got a system, an asset, that has 2 vulnerabilities, for example, and they're both real, they're both there, but one of those 2 is being actively exploited in the wild, I want to make sure that that particular vulnerability has a higher priority for me to remediate. And then we take all this, even things like pen tests, which we talked about earlier, the business criticality of our assets. Does this particular server have financial data, or is it static web content? Knowing the value of the information on a particular asset can only come from those in your organization. But factoring that in is important because, again, you want to prioritize for the assets that you have, their importance to you and your business to really be able to get ahead of this problem. And then at the end of all this, we can calculate a risk score for each asset group and the organization itself. This facilitates both pre- and post-benchmarking as well as meaningful prioritization of those remediation activities. So let's talk a little bit about that scoring. If you could give me the next slide. So what we have is we have something called the RiskSense Security Score, or RS3 scoring model. It's pretty straightforward. This represents your organization's robustness against cyber risks posed to it from existing vulnerabilities and the threats that are associated with those vulnerabilities. We use several factors. We have a custom vulnerability risk rating for each and every vulnerability. We're incorporating information not just from, say, a single, the NVD, the National Vulnerabilities Database, but we're also taking those from multiple countries because, believe it or not, the databases aren't all the same. We get another 20% additional information by making sure that we're pulling from these different sources. So it's super important.
And the active threats aren't the same either across countries as well, right? There can be campaigns going on in different countries to make those a higher threat. Absolutely.
And kind of like watching a view from space of a wildfire, which seems to be relevant right now, you can kind of see where something starts and how it starts to spread. And by having that kind of global view, if you will, we can get in front of stuff rather than always playing defense. So we take these vulnerability risk ratings, the business criticality that I talked about earlier, all those threat intelligence sources, and even things like, of course, the external accessibility. Is this particular asset reachable from the outside or not? All of this factors in to create a score, and then we can take that score and roll it up to give us an organizational score. And with that, enough preaching. Why don't we do some Q&A?
Great. Thank you, John. If you have any questions, you can log them now using the Q&A functionality. Before I jump into the questions, I did want to remind the audience that you will be receiving a follow-up email from EMA. It's going to include the on-demand playback, a PDF of today's slides, and some additional resources. So I hope you will check that out. I'm going to go ahead and jump into the questions. This first one is directed to both of you. It is, many vendors use the term continuous to describe their product. David and John, how do you both define that?
You want to take?
Sure. So I think it's important. We hear that word all the time, so I agree with the question. The issue is, and it kind of comes back to something I was talking about earlier in terms of scale and performance. With continuous, most things aren't done absolutely continuously, right? There is an interval there. The question is, for your organization, how long should that interval be between iterations? And for whatever you're doing, it may be appropriate that it's 10 seconds. It may be appropriate that it's 10 days. So when we say continuous, I think from an industry perspective, it really comes back to, in my opinion, what you need. Now, in research that I have done, continuous is generally at a maximum every 15 minutes, for example, for things like looking at new incidents or things like that. But when you're looking at new vulnerabilities, they probably don't come out that fast. I don't know, John, if you guys have a view on how often the vulnerabilities are actually released on the backside so you can take advantage of those, or the threats, or I should say the threats are released. So what's your perspective on that?
Well, of course, each of those things moves at a different pace.
Yep.
Each vulnerability database is updated, at a different rate. Each threat source happens at a different rate. But this all obviously goes on in real time. And there's also that gap where vendors who report vulnerabilities to the database, from the time something's actually in the wild, it may be 30 days, 60 days before it actually shows up in the database. And so trying to figure out how to close that gap is super important. And so when we think about continuous, what we really want to make sure is that we're on, I guess the best way to put it is as rapid a march as we can reasonably sustain that gives us that kind of that regular interval, that constant march forward.
Yep. And I think, I'll throw a little more thought in there as well. Obviously, if we're talking about quarterly for something like this, that's absolutely unacceptable. That is not continuous. If you're down to every 20 minutes, I think that's overkill, because the opportunity to be breached in 20 minutes from when the vulnerability or the threat becomes available, very, very, very slim. So with vulnerabilities, as you said, each of the databases and sources comes out at different intervals. But if you're checking them on some kind of partial daily or daily basis, the threat window in there is pretty small. So I think that it's going to vary based on the source that you're dealing with, and also from the company perspective, the types of tools you're dealing with. So.
And frankly, most teams can't deal with anything more than daily anyway. So I mean.
Yeah.
There's what we're all shooting for, and then there's the practical realities of what we can do.
Yep, absolutely, right. If I'm stopping every 10 minutes, I'm not getting anything done. What's the next one, Raleigh?
This one is for John. John, what is the difference between the scoring that vulnerability scanners do versus what RiskSense does?
Yeah. Okay. So the scoring word's another word that gets thrown around a lot. So most scanners only use scoring provided by NVD. And that's a really important point. As I mentioned earlier, we not only take NVD, but we take NVDs from other countries. There's often, a big gap, 30, 60 days between when stuff shows up in NVD. So that can't be your sole source. But understandably, this is what the scanners do. RiskSense, on the other hand, not only takes that data, but we also take the threat data, the asset criticality, as I mentioned earlier. It's, again, bringing context to all that and trying to close that gap, trying to make sure that the gap between when a vulnerability actually is birthed and in the wild to when it actually shows up in the database is kind of a recipe for disaster. And so we want to make sure that we're aggressively not only consuming what's been published, but using our own sources, using our own red tests, our own red team pen test data, really trying to be very temporal about the data that's brought in to assess, measure, and score.
Yep. And I think and I'll add that because I think the context part is so important. Using a historical movie reference, if you're trying to get to the knock list in the middle of the building, right, the opportunity for threat and vulnerability, they're very, very small, right? So even if there's a critical threat or a critical vulnerability or both to that particular system, the opportunity to exploit it is very narrow. Whereas if you have a internet-facing web server and that's where your business is done, and there's a threat and or vulnerability, context again totally different. So the priority at needing to fix that or address that can be much, much higher from a business perspective.
Well, and the other piece that's in there, David, is the fact that when a vulnerability is entered into NVD, it gets assigned a severity, and that's frankly what a lot of organizations use in their prioritization efforts. And while that's useful, we've got to recognize that something like, I don't know, is it 70 or 80% of all the vulnerabilities in NVD are weighted towards either 5 or 10. And they seldom change. So even after, say, a heartbleed happens, where we recognize that this is incredibly severe, that severity in the actual database might not reflect the reality of how important this is. And so we have to make sure that we're not just taking this stuff at face value, but we're enriching it and using that context to make sure that it's adjusted properly.
Yep, absolutely.
John, staying on the topic of risk scoring, this attendee wants to know, do you have examples of organizations that are using your risk scoring model effectively with their board or exec level?
State of Arizona comes to mind. They've been working with RiskSense for 3 or 4 years now. It's been a very interesting journey because if you imagine a state government, they have often hundreds of different agencies across the state. And they need to manage all those in a way such that they're improving security not just for one sub-agency, but rather for the whole state government. They started actually doing this about 18 months ago. Each agency has an individual target score that their superiors expect them to hit, and so there's measurement going on there. And then all of those individual scores are rolled up to the head of the state of Arizona, who actually shares the organizational score with the public. So the citizenry actually knows how the state's doing in terms of protecting the information it has. And in the case of a state government, if you think about it, what information does it have? Well, it has information on all of us, right? It has my DMV information. It has voter registration information. There's a lot of information there that we want protected. And so having a state that is forward-thinking and really kind of being proactive in their pursuit of making sure that they are improving their security posture is a huge thing. And so, the state of Arizona has been a great example of somebody who's not only taking and measuring, but also if you think about the complexities of a state government, you have wide-ranging security backgrounds, right? And so being able to do what David was talking about earlier in terms of having reporting that's meaningful to different audiences. Having reporting that might make sense to your average citizen, might be a different report than the overall CISO, might be a different report to the IT person running voter registration. So those kinds of things have worked out really well for the state of Arizona in using our system.
That's great. Thank you, John. Jumping back over to you, David, what kind of ROI timeframe are adopters of threat management solutions really seeing?
So I think that comes back to the company itself, and so the answer is depends, but I'll try and narrow that down for you. Right? Generally speaking, so ROI, return on investment, is looking at the cost of a system based on the cost of doing things the way you were doing them before. So if you're looking at these 10 items, the automation, integration, and the force multiplier and collaboration are things that will be significant in terms of helping you reduce your ROI, because they're going to reduce the amount of time it takes you to actually deal with the situation and then either remediate or putting in some kind of mitigation or compensating control. So I think oftentimes you're looking at your standard business response of being 3 to 5 years, but I think you can actually pull it down much faster than that based on how you accelerate your processes and then improve your humans' ability, your human capital's ability to actually do their job. Because if you're looking at a system now where it takes you a month to remediate whatever, or 60 days was the average, John said, 60 days to remediate a particular issue, and you're getting them on a weekly basis, right? You're falling behind. You're never going to actually catch up. If you can get to the point where you've automated, integrated, collaborated, and so forth, to the point where you're actually able to deal with these things on that weekly basis, then you can at least keep up. And more than likely, with the scale you'll get to, you're not only going to keep up, you're going to be able to address some of that backlog as well. I don't know, John, do you guys have any feedback from your customers on what they're seeing?
Well, I think ROI is such a loaded term. I think some of the stuff, cost reduction, I think is a real item in there as well, in terms of obviously you want to avoid things like a security incident because that costs you money, but you also want to avoid, we talked a little bit about employee turnover in terms of your IT and security folks. That costs you money. You want to talk about, can I do more in less time? Well, that's a time savings. Can I do the same activities with fewer full-time employees? We've had customers who literally, had 4 FTEs doing remediation efforts that were able to reduce it literally by full headcounts. And that allowed them to take those full-time employees and move them into higher value projects to the organization. So these are super meaningful, have super meaningful financial implications beyond just the, did I ROI, return on investment. Sometimes an investment has all kinds of spidering downstream benefits.
Yeah, and so I think you actually mentioned both these terms, so I want to bring them out as well. But with ROI, the two of the major aspects that are dealt with are either cost avoidance or cost reduction, right? So if I implement this system, I'm able to reduce the cost I'm spending on other systems, people, whatever the case is, or am I able to avoid costs from the future, right? By doing this automation, integration, and so forth, am I able to avoid having to hire new people to do more of this job, or am I able to avoid buying other systems or things like that? So as you're looking at the system to buy, right, that's part of that calculation is, well, can I take these 4 people, reduce it by 2, and this isn't a reduction, this is an avoidance, right? And so now I can apply those 2 people, as we mentioned earlier in the webinar as well, to the higher value tasks of dealing with the business and helping and so forth. So I think that the primary aspect of these systems is more so a cost avoidance for future costs, and remediation being a huge one potentially, than it is a cost reduction, if you will.
Yeah, and keeping yourself out of the fire drill mentality. It always Absolutely. Is more expensive from a time and energy perspective to deal with an unplanned fire drill than it is to stay ahead of the thing.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you both for the insight. Let's take one final question. John, this one is for you. My IT and security folks aren't exactly best friends. How have you seen that dynamic affect the desired outcome?
Over the years I've been doing this, certainly, in some organizations, IT and security and OT, for that matter, aren't necessarily best of friends. And so that dynamic can certainly be counterproductive. I think oftentimes it's overstated, but sometimes it's very, very real. And usually this is a case of each side not fully appreciating what the other has to accomplish, and there's this whole unlimited expectations with limited resources thing. At RiskSense, one of the things that we see is this relationship often improves because each side can now see how they're being helped by the other. They now have confidence that when security hands knowledge of a vulnerability to IT, they know that remediation is happening, and they can see it in the reports, they can see it in the outcomes of those remediation activities. And so I think when you can start to quantify not only where you are, but where the activities you're undertaking move you, I think that often is a real benefit to, frankly, teams' confidence, not only in themselves, but with each other. And again, we talked a little bit about, to the extent you're able to grow internal resources, take, perhaps a less experienced IT person, for example, and get them exposure and get them experience. Perhaps they have aspirations of, moving to security, and to the extent you can provide them training and background, there's nothing more valuable than a security person who has the knowledge of the organization's IT footprint. And so to the extent you can have these teams working well together, grow talent internally, and have confidence in each other, I think that makes a huge difference. And I'd like to think that the RiskSense solution actually really helps facilitate that.
Agreed. I think on top of that as well, John, it's moving from that competition to the collaboration. Right, and you mentioned this as well. Throwing stuff over the wall is more of a competitive, strategy than it is a collaborative strategy. So if the tool can facilitate a workflow whereby everybody knows what's going on and what's coming down the pipe, and help with the expectations and so forth, that helps a lot to reduce that animosity. Because I know when I was in operations and working as a CISO, and I had to hand off, here's the list of vulnerabilities, guys, to either the DevOps or IT folks, they were like, oh, great. Right, more work for us to do. But part of it was because they didn't know, is this real or is this a false positive? So you have to get that taken care of. What's the context? You have to get that taken care of. And what's the expectation for delivery on these things? And if the tool can help facilitate these types of conversations as opposed to just, okay, take care of it, let me know when you're done, here comes the grenade, right, then that's going to help quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Great. Thank you both. And I wanted to thank our audience for taking time out of their schedule to join us. I hope you'll check out that email that you'll be receiving later today, and I hope that we'll see you at a future EMA event. Thanks again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.